Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
Life was tough. Life was very tough. I had to remember the basic food we ate. In the winter, there were hardly any vegetables or any fruit. It was basically milk, bread, and a little bit of meat. But my brother and I didn't know any better.
Oggy Boytchev is a former BBC journalist with more than 3 decades of experience reporting from conflict zones across the Middle East, the Balkans and the former Soviet Union. Born in 1955, Oggy grew up under the shadow of a family secret. His father had been branded an enemy of the people and interned without trial in a remote Bulgarian town where he spent years under police supervision and forced labour. Even after his release, the family lived under a constant fear of surveillance, informers and political persecution. From secretly listening to the BBC World Service to navigating a school system steeped in communist ideology, he shares what it was really like to come of age in one of the Soviet bloc's most tightly controlled societies. It's a remarkable story of resilience, caution and quiet resistance, offering a deeply personal perspective on everyday life in Cold War Bulgaria. I'm delighted to welcome Oggy to our Cold War conversation. Before we start, I just want to let you know that Oggy has written several books, the latest of which is The Istanbul Connection, a gripping, morally complex thriller that explores the blurred lines between ideology and manipulation. It's available via a link in our episode notes, and any purchases will help support the podcast.
I was born in 1955 at the height of the Cold War, in a small town in northern Bulgaria called Chermenbrak, or Red River Bank, it translates in English.
And who was in your immediate family?
Mother, father, and a sibling, a brother who is 18 months younger than me. That was the core family. In this small town also lived my maternal grandparents, grandfather and grandmother, and maternal uncle.
What was your parents' employment?
My father was interned in that little town in 1948, branded as enemy of the people, although never convicted in a court of law, and he was made to break stones in the local quarry, which was just outside the town. He was getting paid a little bit, but he couldn't leave the town. He had to sign at the police station twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening, to make sure that he never leaves the town.
And what was the crime that he was interned for?
He said to me many times that he never knew because they never told him. After the fall of communism, my mother went to the Interior Ministry to request his file. They gave her a file, which was heavily redacted, and a summary of his offences. They claimed that he was a member of the internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, which was, in present-day terms, could be classified as a terrorist organization before the advancement of communism in Bulgaria. This was during the 20s, 30s, and during the Second World War. This is an organization which claimed to represent the ideology of Greater Bulgaria, i.e., they wanted territories in Greece and Yugoslavia, which was populated by a Bulgarian-speaking minority, to become part of Bulgaria. Now, that was a very sore subject at the time because this organization was considered to be a nationalist, monarchist organization. And obviously, after 1944, when the Red Army set foot on Bulgarian soil, this organization was proscribed. The second element in the document, in the summary that was given to my mother, was that he had been photographed meeting representatives of the British and American legations, as they were called at the time. They were not full embassies after 1944. He was photographed meeting these people at his office because after the coup d'etat on the 9th of September 1944, when the Red Army entered Bulgaria and there was a coup against the monarchy, and a Fatherland Front came to power, which was a broad anti-fascist coalition, there was a brief period between 1944 and 1947 when Bulgaria was a seeming democracy. And because Bulgaria was an ally of Nazi Germany during the Second World War, um, all the economic ties with Germany were severed. There was a gap in the market. And my father tried to exploit it and started trading with the United Kingdom, mainly importing fabrics and materials from Manchester. Now, whether members of the British legation came to his office to talk about business or talk about politics, I don't know. But the fact is, he was shown photographs of these people meeting him at the office, and that was considered to be an act against the people. These were the reasons set out in this summary given to my mother why he was interned in Chervembrek, Red River Bank, from 1948 to 1965.
And that must have had a huge impact on your family. How did your family manage to support itself? I think you said that he was getting a small wage of some sort.
He was getting a small wage to be able to pay the rent and food for us, but he was an incredibly entrepreneurial person and physically very strong. So he started building a house. So within a few years, he built a small bungalow, which was his own. He got some help from my mother's family, which were not wealthy, but they were getting by, mainly by providing childcare for us, so that both my parents could go to work. Life was tough. Life was very tough. I have to remember the basic food we ate. In the winter, there were hardly any vegetables or any fruit. It was basically milk, bread, and a little bit of meat. But we didn't know any better. My brother and I didn't know any better. For my father, that was a big shock because he came from a relatively wealthy family. He lived in the capital, Sofia. He had traveled abroad. He was an active sportsman. I was a very proficient skier and mountain climber. So for him, that was a big decline, both mentally and physically. But through sheer physical health, he survived.
Incredible. That period of time doing hard labor as well would be tough in itself. And you mentioned there your grandparents. What was their history and how did they fare during World War II?
During World War II, my maternal grandfather was a small trader. He had a market stall in Red River Bank, as I call it, Chervembrek. They had a very small house, basically 2 rooms, 1 bedroom, where they managed to cram everybody in, like my grandparents, my mother, and her brother, and a small kitchen. So by no means were there anywhere near the average standard of a Bulgarian family at that time. But my grandfather managed to save some money by doing his market trading. After the 9th of September coup in 1944, he became a trader in the market, but trading not his own goods, but government goods. He sold basically government goods. This is what they were. I have to say here that my grandfather was a instinctive socialist, and I don't mean that communist. He was a member of the Social Democrat Party during the war, which was a semi-legal party. It was officially allowed to exist, but their activities were heavily restricted. So after the 9th of September coup, the Social Democrat Party was subsumed by the Communist Party. So my grandfather was considered to be a reliable person, as they used to call it at the time. He was not an enemy of the people. So that gave a little bit of impetus to his financial strength as a market trader. And that's why he was able to help my father build a house.
What about the family on your father's side?
Well, a family on my father's side, it's something which I would describe as a Balkan saga. My father was born in the Ottoman Empire. He was born in what is today northern Greece, in an area called Epirus, between the border between Greece and Albania. He comes from a Bulgarian-speaking family. His father was a trader and a shopkeeper in Istanbul, where he made reasonable amount of money. And when he was in his early 40s, he moved back to his homeland and bought a big estate of land and became a farmer. And he, as an older man, he married a young woman and had 10 children. My father was the youngest of the 10. Now, my father was born in 1913. That was the Ottoman Empire. By the time he went to school, he was living in Greece. He went to a Greek school. His first language actually was Greek. Um, I remember when I was a teenager and we used to get visitors from Greece. He was a fluent Greek speaker. He could write Greek. He had basic Turkish, and he's taught himself English and a bit of German in the years before the war and during the war. So during the Great Depression, when he was 15, he was sent from Greece to Bulgaria by his parents because he had two very successful brothers in Bulgaria and Sofia who had successful businesses. So they thought, if we send the young boy to Bulgaria, he'll get looked after. So he came to Bulgaria in, I can't remember exactly, maybe 1928, 1929, started to learn Bulgarian at that sort of late stage in his teenage years, joined the army. It was a sort of a compulsory conscription at the time. And when the war broke out, he was working for one of my uncles who had a business in Sofia. He had a nightclub and a casino. The war years for my father were very interesting. He was a natural Anglophile. He never warmed up to Germany. He was against the Nazis. He was against Bulgarian affiliation with the Nazis. So all his friends were boys and girls from the Jewish community in Sofia, and they used to lock themselves up in one of his friends' cinemas to watch American and English films. That was what he did during the war. It may sound trivial at the moment, but what they were doing was taking incredible risks by doing that. After the communist takeover in 1944, he was not able to go back to Greece. His parents died in Greece in the early 60s. He was not allowed to go back. We were not allowed to go to Greece for their funerals. And yes, it was tough.
It's hard to imagine those times, but appreciate you describing those. Did you have many relatives abroad? I guess if you did, you had difficulty maintaining contact with them.
Yes, we had family in Greece. We still have family in Greece. Now, by twist of fate, um, the family who remained in Greece after my father's departure in the late 20s, during the war, all became part of the anti Nazi resistance. Some of them voluntarily, some of them were coerced in joining the communist partisans in northern Greece. After the civil war in Greece in 1945, when the communist resistance lost, some of them came to Bulgaria, which was going to be a communist country, and some of them were taken to Russia to study. So that is the sort of dichotomy in the family. On the one hand, my father was branded enemy of the people because of his affiliation to a group fighting for Greater Bulgaria and because of his business activities. On the other hand, I had cousins who had studied in Russia and came back to Bulgaria and became communist apparatchiks. So I suspect that this is part of why my father's life was spared.
That definitely is a Balkan saga there. Really appreciate that. It's really interesting. How much interaction was there with the Bulgarian security services because of your father's history?
When I was growing up, I wasn't aware of any interaction with the security services, apart from the fact that my father had to go to the police station twice a day to sign, to demonstrate his presence there. Um, I was told at home not to talk about politics to anybody, not to talk about politics at school, not to talk about my father's background. Just do your studies, because the better you do at school, the greater the chances that you would escape this godforsaken place. Um, Now, in that summary I mentioned before that the Interior Ministry gave my mother, it transpired that my father had been under surveillance as late as 1979, when the surveillance was terminated. This is what the document says. This is just one sentence, which is rather shocking looking back. I was not aware of anything. I went through school, I did well at school. Nothing impeded me in my school endeavors. I was not stopped from doing anything I wanted at school. But the family had been under surveillance until 1979, which is truly shocking.
And no detail apart from that one sentence.
No, absolutely no detail of what and how this surveillance had manifested itself. Now, because my father had family abroad, family in Greece, family in Yugoslavia, because of this cross-border anti-Nazi resistance, some of the family, I have a first cousin in Yugoslavia at the moment, who is a successful businessman. They were part of the Tito communist system there because they were communist partisans, but I was not allowed to go and see them. They were allowed. They used to come to Bulgaria and bring presents and Western LPs and music and cassettes and all that, which we were lacking in Bulgaria, but we were not allowed to go even to Yugoslavia.
You're very isolated where you are. Did you have access to TV, or were you able to listen to the outside world via radio?
We didn't have a TV simply because it was too expensive. When TV was introduced in Bulgaria, I would imagine must have been in the very early 60s, because some of our neighbors bought TV sets in Red River Bank, and we used to go and watch sort of the 7:30 programs in the evening on a black and white, a very small black and white TV set, which was a big experience. And I'm talking, this must have been 1962, 1963. There was no cinema. There was one cinema which was open on a Sunday only, and most of the films were Soviet and Bulgarian films, so there was no access to Western culture. But we had a radio, and that was my and my father's window to the world. Because my father, being an Anglophile, he listened to the BBC World Service in Bulgarian. Now, these transmissions were jammed some of the time, but most of the time the BBC, from what I remember in the 60s and the early 70s, were not jammed because the economy was struggling and they wanted to save energy from jamming the broadcasts of the BBC. They concentrate on jamming Radio Free Europe and Deutsche Welle in Bulgarian. Now, I'm not saying that we were able to listen to the BBC every night because it was touch and go. It was very precarious whether you'd be able to hear a transmission or not. But we got to know the frequencies, and it was a window to the world. It was something that none of my peers, none of my friends at school or in the playground were able to access, or at least I didn't know whether they were able to access because you couldn't talk to anybody. And my father had explicitly forbidden us to talk about it because we knew what might happen. And he always used to give me one example to imbue the fear in our mind, not just me, but my brothers too, that in 1956, he said, when the Hungarian Revolution happened, they were listening to the BBC about what's going on, and one of his friends shared his thoughts within a very limited group of people, like-minded people who were exiled from Sofia, and said, this is the start. Now the Americans will come in and help the Hungarian resistance, and the Russians are finished. The following day, that person was taken away to one of the strictest labor camps on the River Danube. And when he came back to Red River Bank a few years later, he was not the same person. He was physically and mentally broken. So every time my father wanted to instill the fear of God in us, not to tell anybody, he would give this example and say, you must not trust even your closest friends, because he shared these thoughts within a group of maybe 6 or 7 people while they were having a drink at somebody's house, and one of those people informed on him to the police.
I can imagine the impact that had on you. With your schooling, did you just keep your head down and parrot the communist propaganda?
Yes, and this is what my parents told me. You have to excel at school, and if that means you have to parrot the propaganda, you have to learn verses extolling the virtues of Khrushchev, because when I was 7, we had a textbook in Russian at school. We were Duolingo studies. We were studying Bulgarian, learning to read and write Bulgarian, but they tried to teach us to read and write Russian. And most of my classmates resisted, but my father said, no, don't resist, learn, because learning any foreign language will be of benefit to you. Unfortunately, they stopped doing that within a few years, so that by the time I was 10, these Russian language lessons at school had stopped. But I remember having to learn poems in Russian extolling how great Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev was. And I was very good at it. Although my dad used to say, you do that, you excel at school, but don't forget, the most important thing you learn at school is mathematics. Be good at maths, and that will open a whole new window to the world for you. And he was right.
You must have had friends at school. What were they like?
The sad thing is that I could never become very close to anybody. I mean, close that I can share my secrets. And my big secret was that I was listening to the BBC. And I was dying to say to people what I've learned from the BBC, not only about politics, because I didn't understand politics very well. I was shocked when President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. I didn't understand why and what were the driving forces, whereas the communist propaganda was saying, oh, he got what he deserved, whereas the BBC was telling us a completely different story. So it was a bit confusing at the age of 7, but I enjoyed the cultural programs. I enjoyed programs about books and films and television programs and music, which we were never allowed to or listen to. So my circle of friends was very limited. I had 2 or 3 friends, maybe neighbors, but even with them, I couldn't share everything that I wanted to share.
Must have been immense psychological pressure on you at such a young age there, that you're having to, with every word you say outside of the house, be so careful as to what you reveal.
It has made an indelible mark on me, even to the present day. I am very careful what I say, not because I'm afraid, but that's a second nature that has been imbued in me, that you have to be very careful when you choose your words.
Now, in 1965, your father's hard labour internment finishes and you're able to move back to Sofia. What effect does that have?
Oh, I was elated when I was told that we're going back to the big city. I'd only been there visiting with my father. The advantage of my father being a hard worker was that by 1965, the little 2-room bungalow that he built and the wonderful garden he created around it became a very desirable property. So he was able to sell that and buy a 2-bedroom apartment in the center of Sofia, in the old part of Sofia, where properties were cheaper. But nonetheless, I moved from this godforsaken provincial town with unpaved streets to the big city. Our apartment was on the 3rd floor. From our balcony, I could see the star of the Communist Party headquarters, which was a stone's throw away from us. And I embraced it. I just walked the streets. School was very welcoming, although at the beginning I got mocked because I spoke with a provincial accent, having been brought up in this northern Bulgarian town, which I managed to eradicate within a year after I arrived at school. And because I was good at school, the teachers were very welcoming. The advantages of being in a big city, and this is what my father used to tell me, that you always have to strive to live in a big city because you can preserve a degree of anonymity there, is that very few people knew about my father's background. Only if somebody needed to investigate, or if I had to apply for a different school, or when I applied to university, I knew that there were background checks. and all that. But the big city provided anonymity and allowed me to thrive. There were lots of cinemas, there were certain limited number of Western films, mainly French and Italian. There were art exhibitions, and I just embraced it.
So you're aged about 10 or 11 when you moved to Sofia, I'm guessing.
Yes, I was 10.
What are you planning, or what are your parents planning for you for further education and a career? Do they have any ideas?
Yes, I did. My father's idea was that I should become a doctor, that I should study medicine and I should become a doctor, which I resisted right from the beginning because I knew it was not for me. I was more into arts and the humanities and books, and um, but I played along. I played along until the age of 17, when I had to make a decision in my final year at school, and when I declared that I was not going to study medicine and I would do anything else but medicine. And so eventually we settled on, which was partly because I did well at school at maths, and partly my father saw that this was the future. Business and economics will always give me a way of making a living. This is what happened. I had to sit an entrance exam. I enrolled at the Economics Institute in Sofia, aptly named Karl Marx at the time.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Did your father's history not affect your ability to go to university? I've interviewed people from other states in the Warsaw Pact, and certainly in East Germany, it wasn't that easy to go to university unless you were from good proletarian stock or members of the party.
Yes, in most cases, that was probably true in Bulgaria, but you had to have done something which is considered to be an action against the state, which neither my father nor I had done. Having said that, I had to go through a vetting process because I know a friend of my mother's worked at the Economic Institute and said to her that I was going through a vetting which not all students go to after I had passed the exam, but they let me study. Yeah, if I had wanted to go and study in East Germany or in Prague, like some of my friends from high school did, I probably wouldn't have been allowed. But because my slate was clean, I didn't have anything against me. I have no idea whether I have a dossier or a file with the Secret Service. I've refused to go and check simply because I was too busy during the fall of communism. I didn't have the time to deal with this because I was trying to foster my career here in Britain.
What was it like studying at the Karl Marx Economic Institute?
It was a sham degree. It was a degree which didn't teach us very much. I skipped classes quite a lot. I used to go swimming and used to play tennis or skiing in the winter during classes. The exams were very basic. Um, I thought at the time that this was the easiest part of my life. I just cruised through the exams without any effort because it wasn't a very hard degree. Apart from the first couple of years, we did statistics and economic modeling and all that, which was relatively hard, but I cruised through that. And after that, because it was a 4-year course, the latter part, the last 2 years, was mainly international relations, politics, something called scientific communism, which was a complete waste of time. It wasn't very hard. And most of my friends at university didn't work very hard. And I got a reasonable marks at the end, and I got a diploma, and that was that.
Being at university, did that delay any military service that you might have had to do compulsory?
No, I did my compulsory conscription before going to university, between high school and university. This is what everybody did. At the age of 18, I sat the exams for university. I knew I was going to university, but I had to go and do 2 years of military service in a place right in the middle of Bulgaria, which was a very pretty little valley between two mountains, in a tank brigade. And that was a bit of a shock to the system, because I was taken out of this big city and placed. I was taken out of the circle of friends I had, the urban way of life, and put in a place with boys from the countryside, some of them from the Turkish minority, who, to put it politely, very uneducated. And it was a bit of a shock to the system. I made some great friends there, mainly friends from the Turkish minority who were not allowed to go to university if you declare that you're a Turk and you speak Turkish at home and all that. You wouldn't be allowed to go to university. So this was a whole new thing, that a huge new sphere of life that opened in front of me, and I was not aware that it was happening. I was only aware that people like my father, with a black dot on their dossier, would be punished by the system. But I realized that there is a whole new world, that if you are from an ethnic minority, cultural minority, and you prefer to stay that way, you wouldn't be allowed to study at university.
What role did you have in this tank unit?
I had no role whatsoever. I was just an ordinary soldier. For 2 years, I wasn't given any rank or anything. Um, I was in a small unit of sappers. Basically, most of our training was in a classroom, being taught various types of mines, um, both Soviet and Western, and how to disarm them. But I never saw any action. I never done anything in practice, was just basically classroom education.
How was the initial training? I presume there was at least some emphasis on physical fitness. How fit were you?
I was pretty fit because, due to my father's background as a keen sportsman when he was young, he managed to get us into skiing and tennis. And I thought I was pretty fit until the first days of my military service, when I was told to do various exercises with these big, enormous boots and very heavy woolen trousers, and I just couldn't lift my legs on the exercise ground. But I survived. The first 6 months were tough. All I remember from that time was that I slept almost 12 hours a day. Every single minute I got spare, I was asleep. That was the physical exertion that had an effect on me.
Was there any emphasis in the training on the ideology?
Yes, but not very hard, I have to admit. I think by that time, the communist regime, in my opinion, thought it was pretty secure in its position. We had ideology classes, but even the trainers weren't very keen on, well, teaching them. We tried to go out and in open spaces and have the classes there. But again, I had been taught these things at school. I knew the basics by heart. So anytime they would ask a question, I had a prepared answer. They thought we were very good.
Now, you said you did 2 years compulsory service. Now, so you're discharged round about 1978, and you hear an announcement on the BBC.
Yes. We had an announcement that the Bulgarian dissident writer Georgi Markov, who had been broadcasting on the Bulgarian service of the BBC for a number of years, and my family and myself had listened to some of his broadcasts, had been murdered on Waterloo Bridge in London. That was the beginning of September, I clearly remember. And we were stunned because although we knew that the regime was brutal, we didn't think that the long arm of the Communist Secret Service will stretch to London. So that was a shock, but provided a topic for a lot of conversations. And even people who were not interested in politics, or even ardent communists, who I knew were ardent communists and supporters of the regime, were openly talking about it, which for me was a sign that something was happening in the regime, that people were becoming freer to exchange information. Not that the regime was about to fall, by no means, but that there was something happening, a slight relaxation in the control over what people talked about in the street.
I guess you are still very wary and don't enter into those discussions publicly.
Yes. Yes, it's at that time I was very careful not to express an opinion, quote what I'd read about Markov in the mainstream communist press in Bulgaria, which wasn't very much. We all knew as teenagers, we all knew Markov because he was one of the writers of blockbuster hit television series, which was released for the first time in 1969 to mark the 25th anniversary of the communist takeover. He was the screenplay writer of a series called At Every Kilometer. It was the first commercially successful thriller, anti-fascist thriller on Bulgarian TV. It depicted the brave struggle of a group of anti-communist fighters against the fascist regime of the Second World War. But what made this television series more exciting and had an edge to it was that the timeline stretched beyond the communist takeover in Bulgaria into the 1950s and 60s, and what happened to the head of the fascist secret service called Geshev, who emigrated to the United States just before the communist takeover. That was an edgy thing to do. And Markov was one of the writers. So by mid-1970s, after his defection, when they were rebroadcasting this series, his name had been erased from the credits. Although he was the writer, he was not in the credits, which was another big topic for discussions among people my age at the time. So we knew who he was. We knew that he was talented, although by that time I hadn't read any of his books, which had been published in Bulgaria at that time, which had implicit criticism of the regime. But his broadcasts about his private meetings with the communist leader Todor Zhivkov hit a nerve. It showed a side of the communist dictator which we were never allowed to see. Private conversations, what he thought about art, about politics, because with the carefully curated images of all communist dictators in Eastern Europe at the time, you only saw a very official image of that person. And those private conversations with Zhivkov is said to have tipped the balance, and Zhivkov was so incensed that he decided to get rid of him. I have no idea whether that's true or not, because when the archives were opened after 1989, there was hardly anything left on the Markov case in the Interior Ministry archive. It had been shredded or taken. Some people said it had been taken to Moscow, whoever you want to believe.
And you learn a little bit more about what went on there later on in your life, and we'll come to that in a little while. After you finish at university, what work do you take on?
After I finished university, there was a system in Bulgaria at the time that you had an officially approved job allocation. You were allocated a job. And all my friends and people I went to university in our group had been allocated jobs, and I wasn't. So 3 months passed, and I didn't have a job. So my father, who by that time had trained himself to lay floors, wooden floors and carpets, working for a state company, but his skills were in great demand, he suggested that I should go and work with him. So I did. So I worked with him laying floors for 6 months. And then suddenly, out of the blue, a letter arrives that I've been allocated a job at a shipping company, a shipping company's office in Sofia. The Bulgarian fleet was based in Varna on the Black Sea, but there was an office in Sofia, so a tiny little office, and I went there and started my work as a shipping agent. I never in my wildest dreams had I ever thought that I will end up working as a shipping agent, but this is what happened.
Not really part of the career plan.
No.
How had you learned English in Bulgaria? How had you managed to pick up that language?
That is another story. But because my father was an Anglophile, he paid for me to go to English lessons. There were private lessons you could take in Bulgaria at the time when we moved back to Sofia. And religiously, he paid for me to go to English lessons twice a week to see a private tutor. And it wasn't very expensive. I had the grounding. And then in 1969, when I was 14, out of the blue, my father said, "You should apply to sit the exams at the English language school in Sofia." And I said, "No way. This is a school which is reserved only for people with privileges." That was a system of patronage in Bulgaria, probably in other East European countries. If you belong to a certain family, when you apply for university or school or for jobs for that matter, you're immediately afforded a privilege, i.e., you jump the queue. And I said, "No way, I can be accepted there." And he said, "Go and try it. And if they sit the exam, see how you do. And if you do well and they don't take you in, then we'll know where you stand." And he had been told that spaces at that school were allocated to people without privileges, people who would be judged only on the basis of the exams. So, against my better judgment, I took the summer off. Instead of going on summer camp or sports camp, I studied very hard. The exams were maths and Bulgarian. And I sat the exams, and I had one of the best scores on the board. By the beginning of September, I still hadn't, although I was on the board with one of the best scores, probably I think I was second best, I hadn't had a letter from the school whether I'd been accepted or not. So probably some frantic background checking had been going on at the time. But by the 15th of September, the first school day in Bulgaria, I had a letter that I had been accepted and I joined the school. And lots of people had told me after that, God, you are the only person who studies in this school, which I know for sure is without privileges. So that opened a whole new world to me because I was immediately put in an environment where most of my classmates, all of my classmates, were sons and daughters of high-ranking communist apparatchiks. So I had to be very careful what I say, what I do, what kind of friendships I strike, and all that. And that sort of curtailed my sort of networking in present days parlance at school. But I made some very good friends at that school, and I stayed friends with them for a long time after that. This is how I picked up my English. I have to say here that we had an Englishman as a teacher once a week. We had the privilege of being taught by a real native Englishman, Mr. Hayes, who will teach us not just English, but various other cultural things. For example, his masterstroke was that in the break, between the two periods, because we had two back-to-back periods with Mr. Hayes, he would leave pop music magazines on his desk, unattended, and leave the room, and we will swarm around them and started gobbling up the pictures, the writing. We didn't understand much of it, but it was a window to a world which had been denied to us.
That's an incredible image that you've shared with me there. Do you think that maybe it's some of your family members in the party had helped influence getting that place at the English school?
Not to my knowledge. It is possible then when they did the background checks, they had already enough information about my family in Greece and their part in the anti-Nazi partisan struggle, because one of my cousins, my father's eldest sister's son, had returned from Moscow to Bulgaria, and he became very close to my father. Now, this is pure conjecture on my part, because I have no evidence that anybody had asked him to do. Maybe my parents had done it without telling me, but that wouldn't have happened without me scoring high the exam.
At what point do you think I need to get out of Bulgaria? I'm not going to get anywhere here. To hear the answer to that question and how Oggy escapes from Cold War Bulgaria, you'll have to come back next week. Want to learn more about this episode? Don't miss the extras such as curated videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the episode information. Special thanks to the generous efforts of our financial supporters who keep the show on the air. If you'd like to join this select band, go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations on Facebook. Thanks very much for listening and see you next week.